Okay, so how sophisticated is this show? I'm going to quote you from a 14th century philosopher to start this segment. William of Ockham said, "It is vain to do with more what can be done with less." Duh, right? Makes sense. That quote, though, is one of the essential elements of a book called Less. That's the name of the book, Accomplishing More by Doing Less. And it is by Marc Lesser. Marc Lesser is well, he's a Buddhist teacher. He's got an MBA. He teaches meditation, but he also consults with companies and individuals and trying to figure out just how to make life make any sense at all, which is not an easy job, I might add.
I started and ran a publishing company called Brush Dance that I did for 15 years, and I also lived at the San Francisco Zen Center for 10 years when I was in my 20s.
And so he's got some wonderful philosophy and some wonderful lessons to be learned here. Just for starters, when you talk about, we're not talking about necessarily buying less or necessarily, you know, living with cheaper food. What we're talking about is just mentally doing less. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, there's a lot to be said about, especially in these times, about consuming less. But what I'm talking about are the things that are underneath those kinds of things. For example, I talk about less fear and less assumptions and less distractions. And I think so much of our culture and so much of the busyness in our culture is around fear and around false assumptions that we make and around different ways that we tend to distract ourselves.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because busyness is in a sense the enemy, and reading the book, you realize fear is a major motivator of busyness in many ways, and you may not even realize it, but that's what's driving so many of us.
Yeah. Well, busyness has become the new fine in our culture. When you meet someone on the street, how are you?
Oh,
busy,
so busy, gosh.
Right? And it's like it's a badge of honor, and you get extra credit if you're checking your BlackBerry while you say how busy you are. And I point out in the book that there's nothing wrong with busyness. I'm not pointing out what I think of as the good kind of busy, which is being engaged and focused and having a sense of real heart with what you're doing. I'm talking about busyness that is a kind of avoidance, where you are avoiding things that are difficult, avoiding the painful, not so comfortable things in life. And also, a lot of busyness is confusing activity with productivity. The fact that you are active and doing things doesn't mean that you're being productive.
I get on an airplane. We talked about this beforehand. I get on an airplane and immediately I'll sit down. First, I'll grab a book instantly. I'm not going to just sit there and do nothing. I'll look at my seatmate who doesn't have a book, who has nothing, who will sit through the whole 4-hour, 10-hour, 20-hour flight, staring at the seat in front of them if there's no movie, or staring at the movie. Is that person doing the right thing? Am I just this crazy, obsessed nut trying not to think about my problems?
No, as you were describing it, we were talking, it sounded to me like these are two different versions of busyness. One is someone who's kind of avoiding by just sitting there and spacing out. It's like watching television or flipping through the channels. Yeah. And yours is the other version is just getting in there and doing. So what about just relaxing, stopping, kind of checking in with your own, imagine checking in with your well, just by perhaps checking in with your own breath, your own body, your own state of mind as a starting point. And then you can decide, what do I need to do next? What's the most important thing for me to do now? And how do I want to go about doing this? As opposed to just jumping right in. Like there's a quote at the very beginning of the book, a Mark Twain quote that says, having lost sight of our goals, we redouble our efforts. Right. So that's a little bit, as you were describing yourself, it's like, oh, you know, you're just like got so much to do, but it's like, well, wait a minute, what is really important to you?
You talk about the idea, I mean, there are several ideas, but there's the momentary, take a moment, but you talk about Sabbath, just taking a time. Would you explain that? Yeah,
I describe at the end of the book that when my children were young, having a weekly Sabbath, one day each week. There's a lot of wisdom to the old Jewish and Christian Sabbaths, and we had 3 very simple rules. One was no spending money, 2 was no electronics, and 3 was that we would do something together as a family. And these, as you can imagine, these 3 rules were not small, and they had a huge. They completely changed the quality of our day. But I want to also say that one of the things I teach a lot to business people is that you can take what I think of as a mini Sabbath right in the middle of a busy workday. You could stop and pause even for 30 seconds or a minute, just as a way of stopping, being in touch with your own breath, and just imagine just appreciating being alive during the middle of a busy, difficult day.
We've got to stop and pause now, but not for the right reasons. Unfortunately, we have to go. Let me tell folks that Marc Besser is going to be appearing March 19th at Copperfields in Sebastopol, March 22nd at Book Passage in Corte Madera. It's a really excellent read. The book is called Less. There's also a website called Accomplishing More by Doing Less, which is well worth looking at. It's quite the revelation, folks. It's quite worth looking at. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henry. Appreciate it.